We are taught that American democracy is an unbreakable fortress. We are told that fascism was a foreign disease, a madness that infected Italy and Germany while the United States stood as a beacon of liberty. But this is a lie. A carefully curated, sanitized lie designed to protect the reputations of the families whose names are still carved into the stone of your hospitals, your libraries, and your banks. In 1933, the United States did not stand as a beacon. It stood on a razor's edge. While the public was distracted by breadlines and the Dust Bowl, a shadow government was being assembled in the smoke-filled private clubs of New York City. They had the money. They had the weapons. They even had the army. All they needed was a dictator to lead the march on the White House. This isn't a conspiracy theory from the dark corners of the internet. This is a matter of congressional record. It is the story of how J.P. Morgan, the DuPont dynasty, and the inner circle of American capital plotted to overthrow President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and install a fascist regime in Washington, D.C. They called it the business plot. And if you think this is ancient history, look around you. They may have lost the battle in 1934, but you need to ask yourself, did they actually lose the war? To understand why the wealthiest men in America wanted to overthrow their own government, you have to smell the air in Central Park in the winter of 1933. It didn't smell of roasted chestnuts or pine trees. It smelled of burning trash, unwashed bodies, and rotting lumber. In the shadow of the skyscrapers built by the Roaring Twenties, a new kind of city had emerged: Hoovervilles. These weren't just homeless encampments. They were shanty towns of apocalyptic proportions. Veterans of the Great War, men who had stormed German trenches, were now living in shacks built from scrap metal and cardboard boxes. They wrapped themselves in newspapers, dubbed Hoover blankets, to survive the freezing nights. The middle class had evaporated. The unemployment rate hit 25%. In industrial cities like Toledo, it was 80%. America was a powder keg waiting for a match. The people weren't just hungry, they were radicalizing. The Communist Party was filling union halls. The threat of a Red Revolution wasn't paranoia. It was a mathematical probability. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt. To the starving millions in the Hoovervilles, FDR wasn't just a president. He was a biblical figure. He offered the New Deal, a promise that the state would intervene to save the citizen. He created jobs, built dams, and put food on tables. He effectively saved American capitalism from destroying itself. But here lies the deadly paradox. Salvation for the poor was viewed as a death sentence for the ultra-rich. Where the people saw a hero, the dynasties of Wall Street saw a thief who had broken into their private vault. To three specific men, FDR wasn't a politician. He was a class traitor who had to be removed. Let's open the files on the men who decided that democracy was too expensive to keep. J.P. Morgan Jr., the architect, head of the House of Morgan. For decades, his bank acted not just as a lender, but as the unofficial treasurer of the planet. During the First World War, Morgan didn't just finance the conflict, he monetized it. He became the exclusive purchasing agent for Britain and France, funneling over $3 billion through his accounts. He decided which nations got loans and which went bankrupt. When Roosevelt abolished the gold standard, Morgan realized a terrifying truth. He was losing control over the printing press itself. For him, the New Deal wasn't a reform. It was a personal robbery. He needed a government that answered to the ledger, not the voter. Irene DuPont, the supplier, the king of the chemical empire DuPont, and the controlling force behind General Motors. His family held the monopoly on the gunpowder and explosives that America used to fight its wars. But Irene was more than a businessman. He was a social Darwinist. He viewed his workers as raw material, expendable assets on a balance sheet. He called unions a communist tumor and poured millions into radical organizations to crush labor laws. He stated openly that democracy was a mistake because it interfered with the natural dominance of capital. He didn't want a president. He wanted a CEO for the country. John D. Rockefeller Jeter, the collaborator. His Standard Oil was a state within a state, operating with its own foreign policy. While Roosevelt spoke of patriotism, the Rockefellers were finalizing secret patent deals with the Nazi conglomerate IG Farben. They helped Hitler develop synthetic fuel technology in exchange for market stability and a guarantee of strike-free labor in their European plants. For Rockefeller, fascism wasn't an enemy. It was a highly efficient business partner that offered order. These three men shared a common fear. They believed that if Roosevelt wasn't stopped, their dynasties would crumble under the weight of taxes and regulations. They needed a solution outside the Constitution. But billionaires do not dirty their hands, they hire people for that. History books often dismiss Gerald McGuire as a lone wolf or a confused bond salesman. This is a deliberate lie designed to sever the link between the crime and the architects. McGuire was not a random operative. He was a high-level employee at Grayson MP Murphy & Co.'s. And who was Grayson Murphy? He was a director at Guarantee Trust, a bank controlled directly by the Morgan interests. He sat on the boards of Anaconda Copper and Bethlehem Steel. The chain of command is undeniable. The money flowed from Morgan and DuPont through Murphy to McGuire. McGuire was the bagman, the intermediary sent to execute the acquisition of a general. When McGuire began his courtship of Major General Smedley Butler, it wasn't a casual conversation. It was a calculated intelligence operation. The cabal needed a figurehead, an American Mussolini who could command the loyalty of the veterans. They chose Butler because he was a soldier, and they assumed a soldier would follow orders. The recruitment process was aggressive. It started with small requests, testing the general's pliability, but quickly escalated to hard finance. The evidence trail left by McGuire is staggering. He didn't just offer words, he offered tangible assets. The general was not asked to join a political party. He was presented with a business transaction. Bank checks began to slide across the table. McGuire flashed a bankroll of $1,000 bills, currency that was practically mythical during the Depression. He stated clearly that the financial backing was unlimited. "We have $3 million in cash on the table right now," he declared. "The DuPonts are in. The Liberty League is the front." McGuire wasn't just bragging. He was providing proof of funds. He detailed the liquidity available to sustain an army, believing he was closing a deal with a mercenary. He never suspected that the man sitting across from him wasn't checking the figures for profit, but memorizing them for an indictment. August 1934. The shadow of the Eiffel Tower looms over Paris. Before the money could be deployed in America, the methodology had to be perfected in Europe. Gerald McGuire was sent on a tour, not a vacation, but a study mission. He walked the streets of Paris, observing the Croix de Feu, the Cross of Fire. He watched paramilitary units of veterans moving with clockwork precision, bypassing the chaos of the French Parliament. He traveled to Berlin. He studied the brown shirts. He didn't see tyranny. He saw efficiency. He saw a model where the messiness of democracy was replaced by the rigid hierarchy of a corporation. McGuire wrote back to his bosses in New York. His letters were not filled with horror, but with excitement. He had found the solution to the Roosevelt problem. The model was simple. Keep the president as a ceremonial figurehead, a puppet to wave at crowds, but create a new position of absolute power, a Secretary of General Affairs, who would run the nation on behalf of the banks. He brought this blueprint back to America, ready to overlay it onto the map of Washington, D.C. With the general targeted and the blueprint secured, the conspirators activated the machinery. This was not a plan that existed only on paper. The infrastructure was being built in plain sight. The operation relied on three pillars: legitimacy, firepower, and propaganda. First, legitimacy. They created the American Liberty League. To the public, it was a patriotic organization dedicated to the Constitution. In reality, it was a money-laundering vehicle for the coup. Its donor list was a map of American industrial power. the DuPonts, the heads of General Motors, the executives of Birdseye, and General Foods. They poured millions into this organization to create a veneer of respectability for the coming treason. Second, firepower. You cannot march on Washington with empty hands. The plan leveraged the DuPont control over Remington Arms. The strategy was to supply the 500,000-man army with rifles and munitions on credit. It was a chilling vertical integration. The same companies that profited from the Great War were now preparing to profit from a civil war, supplying the weapons to overthrow the government they had once served. Third, propaganda. McGuire revealed that they had secured media alliances. Newspapers would be paid to spin the narrative. The March on Washington wouldn't be framed as a coup. It would be framed as a necessary rescue of a president whose health was failing. They would gaslight the entire nation into accepting a dictatorship under the guise of patriotism. The trap was set. The money was wired. The weapons were ready. The only variable they couldn't control was the conscience of the man they hired to pull the trigger. General Butler realized he was the only thing standing between the Republic and a military dictatorship. But he knew that in a court of law, the word of a radical Quaker general against the combined wealth of Wall Street would be worthless. They would paint him as senile. They would call him a liar. He needed a corroborated record. He didn't turn to the police. He turned to the press. Butler recruited Paul Comley French, an investigative reporter for the Philadelphia Record. This was not a standard interview, it was a sting operation. Butler positioned French as an expert in veteran affairs, a necessary administrator for the logistics of the Army. McGuire, blinded by his own arrogance and desperate for competence, accepted French into the fold. In the subsequent meetings, McGuire stopped speaking in code. He dictated the full scope of the treason to French, who committed every detail to memory and later to type. McGuire explicitly confirmed the DuPont backing. He confirmed the Remington Arms connection. He laid out the ultimatum for Roosevelt. You can either resign, or you can serve as a figurehead. He compared the American future to the Italian fascist model. The smoking gun wasn't a weapon, it was a transcript. When French sat down at his typewriter, he wasn't just writing a story. He was typing out a confession that linked the captains of American industry to a plot to destroy the Constitution. The intelligence gathering was complete. The evidence was irrefutable. It was time to go to Congress. November 1934. Butler testifies. The details are explosive. He names names. He outlines the budget. He exposes the structure of the American Liberty League, and then the machine turned on. The media, largely owned or influenced by the very interest Butler was exposing, launched a coordinated attack. The New York Times, in a shameful display of bias, ran headlines mocking the story as a gigantic hoax. They painted Butler as senile, naive, or hallucinating. Time magazine ridiculed him. The establishment circled the wagons. The committee itself was terrified. They released a final report. Listen to this carefully, because this is where the history books fail you. The committee stated, in the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. They confirmed it. They confirmed the plot was real. They confirmed McGuire was guilty. But here is the punchline, the dark joke at the heart of American justice. No one was prosecuted. Not a single person. Gerald McGuire died shortly after under suspicious circumstances. Pneumonia, they said, but rumors of silence persisted. The DuPonts were never subpoenaed. J.P. Morgan was never dragged to the stand. The names of the wealthy backers were redacted from the final public version of the report. Why? Because the committee realized that to prosecute this crime, they would have to dismantle the entire U.S. economy. The plotters were too big to jail. The deep state wasn't a hidden cabal. It was the visible infrastructure of American capital. You might think this is where the story ends. The plot failed, democracy survived, and we all lived happily ever after. But if you believe that, you've missed the point entirely. The coup didn't fail, it just changed tactics. The business plot of 1933 taught the American elite a valuable lesson. Overt coups are messy. Marching on Washington with rifles is crude and risky. It is much more effective to buy Washington, piece by piece, law by law. The American Liberty League didn't disappear. It morphed. The money that was meant to fund a fascist army was redirected into think tanks, lobbying firms, and political action committees. The families involved, the DuPonts, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, retained their positions at the top of the pyramid. They realized they didn't need a Secretary of General Affairs if they owned the senators who wrote the laws. Smedley Butler died in 1940, warning until his last breath about the military-industrial complex, a term Eisenhower would later make famous, but which Butler lived. He is remembered as a hero by the Marine Corps, but his most heroic act, saving the United States from fascism, is barely a footnote in high school history textbooks. Why? Because history is written by the victors, and in the long war for control of America, the men who plotted in the shadows of 1933 never really lost. They just bought the publishing house. So the next time you hear about saving democracy or the dangers of foreign influence, remember the business plot. Remember that the greatest threat to American liberty didn't come from Moscow or Berlin. It came from a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, paid for with a check signed by the men who built the skyline. The plot is not dead. It is merely waiting for the next crisis, the next panic, the next opportunity to close the deal,